Time for a new episode of Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures for KISS Professional Solutions, 1300 KISS PS 547777, and their website is www.kissps.com.au. John McEncrow and the team. They're the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria, with a larger small business in Melbourne, Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury. They also cater for businesses in Wagga. They offer business phone systems, NBN services, CCTV and security systems. It's part 3 of our preview of the AFL season. I've got the walking encyclopedias and well-known sports broadcasters, Darren, Parkin and Damian Watson with me. Today we're looking at Melbourne, North Melbourne, Port Adelaide and Richmond. Welcome, gentlemen. Before we look at the 4 teams, and we did discuss this last week, there was a raft of injuries. It's just got worse over the last week or so. Cody Waitman out for the first half of the season with a knee complaint for the Bulldogs. Curnow, it's Charlie Curnow at Carlton. He might be right, they reckon, for the opening round of the season. He's got a knee complaint, calf injuries, hammy injuries everywhere. Parko, it's a real concern, isn't it?
It is, and I guess for Charlie, he had that lingering injury at the back end of last year that was constantly a week or 2 weeks and ended up missing 6 or 7 or whatever it was and closed out his year. Cody Waitman, very important to the Bulldogs. I know they've got a lot of scoring avenues, but obviously with the Jamara Ugle-Hagan situation kind of up in the air, Riley West had some good moments, but Waitman is that real X factor. They're a significantly better player when he's out there. So I think every club would just be hoping that the ball gets bounced in the opening round. I know as a Saints fan, we've lost players and haven't played a game yet. So you would expect in practice matches that you're going to get a bit more carnage as well, where you start to get those physical hit-outs and players start to get impact injuries like shoulders and stuff like that.
But Damian, at the moment with these match simulations, and we saw the Bulldogs Essendon game on the weekend, and the Bulldogs forums fired up and said Beveridge needs to be sacked. And I said, hang on a second, they used 35 players.
Wayne Silver's style.
Yeah. They basically made the rules up themselves. It is a concern that these injuries are occurring in these matches.
It is. I can't really put my finger on maybe the cause. There's been a lot of theories thrown about. Probably the one I deviate towards more so than others is perhaps they have too long off at the end of the home and away season. But I guess there's an argument against that as well, in that you don't want to, I guess, overload the players with a significant workload throughout the entire year. They've got to take a rest and their bodies have got to take a rest. But I do wonder whether having, a few months off and then they come back for a stint before Christmas, then take a bit of time off over Christmas and then come back in the hot weather, whether that sort of stop-start approach has some sort of effect. But then again, as I have mentioned to you before, we did this for years and years and years. In fact, ultimately, we had a pre-season competition until effectively 2013, and that was of a higher intensity. And we did see players getting injured as well back then, maybe not to the extent as we're seeing at the moment. But I just wonder if it's just going to be one of those outlier years where there's a lot of bad luck.
And if that's the case, Parko, it means that your depth is going to have to be pretty good. And if your depth isn't good, you're in trouble. You could look, if your top end players stay up, you're fine. But at the end of the day, you lose those middle range players. It means that your depth is still sorely tested.
It is. And look, Carlton, towards the back end of last year, it was a lot of the top end talent that they lost. Now, you might be able to, if you've got good depth, pick off players around the fringes. But if you're losing, say in Carlton's case, a Charlie Curnow or someone that's pivotal to your structure, in St Kilda's case, hypothetically, a Rowan Marshall or something like that, or in the Bulldogs' case, Norton or Tim English, you can't replace certain aspects of your list. And it doesn't matter how good you are. And injuries aren't an excuse, but they are a reason, as they say. Like if you take the Brisbane side that won the 3 in a row in 1, 2, and 3 and said, okay, you've got to play a season without Voss and Lappin, nobody on earth would expect them to be as good as they were during that time. It's just a fact. So, I think injuries are more of a factor than people would give them credit for.
And the other point too, Damian, if you then add players late in the pre-season to your list, and I look at the Bulldogs with this Braden Crosley, big goober from Southport Sharks.
Southport. Yeah.
Now, they're actually saying, people on the forum are going to say, how can you possibly have him? He looks overweight. He looks unfit. The point needs to be made. He's had a full-time job. He's had a VFL pre-season. They might add him to the list. He's going to take quite a few weeks to get AFL match fit, isn't he?
Yeah, you would think so. And he's done a very good job, admittedly, at VFL level,
Mm.
but it is a bigger standard in the AFL. There's no question about that. And yeah, it's going to take time. There's no doubt about that. And look, I've enjoyed watching him play. I've seen a lot
Mm.
of him over the last few years, Braden Crosley. He does work his backside off and does his absolute best in terms of ground coverage. And I think he's probably underestimated. I think people do look at him and think he'd be a bit slow McNolland type, but his ground coverage is actually deceptively good. And he holds his own, I guess, in a one-on-one in the air, but his ground coverage is actually not too bad. So we'll see what is made of him. I do have my doubts, so as we do with a lot of players, some just have a knack of adapting very quickly to the AFL intensity, and some don't when they come from VFL level.
Well, there's quite a few that are doing it, Parko. We see Dominic Brew might get a go at the Dogs, and we know the
Mm.
Dogs have tried a few that haven't quite worked out. And I know Melbourne have picked up a pretty good player as well, who's played a lot of football too. So there's often a reason why these players are picked up late, that maybe they're not quite good enough.
Yeah.
Sean Manor was pretty good in patches last year, but at the end of the day, it's good they do get that opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think clubs have still got that bias towards the kid. I think they might look at someone and say they tick all of these boxes, but it's almost like they have that thing in the back of their head. Well, why wasn't he drafted? Am I missing something? Is there a reason? What has held him back? And then you look at your Sam Mitchell stories and your James Podsiadleys and Michael
Barlow.
Barlow and those sorts of guys. Yeah, when you give them the chance, perhaps a few more years in the system playing against men serves them well. So yeah, I still think there's a bit of a stigma attached to it with it.
We're having a little bit of an issue, Parko, with your internet at the moment, but we will press on. We're here for KISS Professional Solutions, Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures. We're previewing the AFL season. It's part 3 today. Melbourne, North Melbourne, Port Adelaide and Richmond. We will start, Damian, with Melbourne. I think that these 4 teams won't make the 8, even with the Port Adelaide situation and Ken Hinkley making the decision to make this year his last year. Could the pressure be off? I think with Melbourne, they've lost Neil Bullen. They've got a couple of very good high draft picks who might be ready to play straight away in Langford and Lindsay. I still worry about their forward line, and they're very, very good players at 30 or plus now. May, Gawn, Petrarca. Well, it'll be his first game back for some time. Will Clayton Oliver be better? Who knows?
Yeah.
I'm still not convinced about the Demons. I just have a feeling, even though Simon Goodman says they've got a new game plan, I can't see them making the 8 at this stage, even though, as I say, the top end talent's pretty good, but getting old.
Yeah, it was a tumultuous year last year, and you got to remember too, Dan. One of the things they struggled with, which was a surprise to many, they were 16th in the competition when it came to clearances per game on a per game basis last year in 2024. When you consider, I know Oliver had a bit of a watered down season, but when you consider the caliber of that midfield talent wise in general, it's pretty low bar that was set. So they've got to get the ball out of the centre for starters, and you're right, the forward line they need a few more avenues to goal. Their defence is reasonably sound, but I think they rely very heavily on Gawn, Petrarca, Oliver, May, Lever, all playing 20-plus games. And if they do that, I reckon they can sneak into the finals, but that's a lot of ifs, buts, and maybe when you consider the potential for injuries. It'll be interesting to see how Van Rooyen goes in regards to his development. He's been hanging around for the last couple of years, whether he's going to be the answer up forward. I think Caleb Windsor has a lot of upside as well. We know about Rivers and McVee and those type of players. So there is a little bit of positive there from a youth perspective, but I don't know if they're going to make the finals if they have injury tests throughout the year. So they'd be teetering around the mark, I think, because there's still a little bit of talent. But I don't know if they just have enough depth.
I've got them between 9th and 12th. I worry about their forward
Yep.
line. Does Petty play forward? Does he play back? Daniel Turner be looking for a good year. Jefferson, they keep talking about him, but he really hasn't been much of an opportunity. Damian, on the Melbourne situation, and obviously the fact that Gary Pert has left, and also Kate Roffey has left, the president. Stephen Smith will eventually take over. Brad Green is the interim president at the moment. Is that going to help them?
Well, it'll give them a fresh start, but there's always going to be a few teething issues in many respects. But they got to try and solidify a culture that works, and it does play a part. I think what happens is we've seen at Carlton over the years, Dan. If there's too many factions in various places, it's going to filter down and affect the psyche of the club. And we did see a little bit of that. There were so many things. It was sort of a perfect storm in a way, all the controversies they had last year. So I think it does help in the sense that it gives them a fresh start. They can forget about last year, the issues with Petrarca as well. They've sorted all of that out. So yeah, I think it's better than nothing at the end of the day to have that different senior board or just, the senior personnel within the club in the hierarchy.
Parko, what's your view on Melbourne? How do you think they'll go? Do you think they're top eight material, or do you still feel there's not enough improvement, particularly in the forward line?
I think there's still a lot of obvious talent on the list in terms of what we saw over the last few years. That the Achilles heel had always been their ability to score. Last year was a significant example of that. They dropped by more than 2 goals a game, the biggest scoring drop away of any club in the comp. They went from being ranked fourth in attack to being ranked 13th in attack in the space of 12 months. And look, they started last year really well. They were 4-1 after 5 rounds, having won in Adelaide twice. But a 21-point swing. I think last week I said that Adelaide were the biggest disappointment in the comp last year. It was actually probably Melbourne, and then you have Adelaide. I think for Melbourne to go from 3 years in the top 4 down to 14th, and you've touched on all of the distractions. Petrarca with the injury management on the King's birthday, Oliver, Willie Won'ty, Max Gawn getting annoyed at leaks coming from out of the club, Will Pickett leave and head back to WA. Now, none of those things ended up happening, which I guess is a positive sign. And, they've re-established commitment in Goodwin and all of that type of stuff. But I guess until you see all of that go away, I mean, I'm not worried about Petrarca. He's a professional unit. He'll do the best thing he possibly can. It's just whether there's any lingering effects from the injury. Oliver would be a bit more of a mystery. The scoring avenues would be a bit more of a mystery. But yeah, I think they're capable of more than they've got, but there's too many question marks to say that they can win the flag. But I reckon if they miss the 8, they'd be pretty disappointed. I think they've certainly got a top 8 talent in terms of their list.
Yeah, as I say, the forward line does worry me. So you think they can make the 8, Darren? Do you?
They can, but I don't think they can contend. I think there's
Yeah.
just too many issues in that regards. And I think when you've got people coming out to make statements that aren't true, Gary Pert infamously saying it's the best culture he'd ever seen in footy. Now, everybody knows that can't have been the case. But, there's still some things that if it happens, they'll be all right. I mean, Jacob van Rooyen, he was an underrated absence a couple of years ago in the finals when he got suspended in the first one against Collingwood, because you put that on top of McDonald and Brown and Melksham and everyone else that was unavailable. They were playing Petrarca forward, and then Brayshaw got injured, so Petrarca had to go back into the middle. Van Rooyen, I think a 30-goal year for him. If he can turn that into a 45, 50-goal year, then that gives them something. But yeah, I think and obviously the defensive unit with Salem running off halfback and May and Lever and these sorts of guys, there's enough to work with there. But yeah, too many question marks for mine compared to, say, other teams in a similar boat like Collingwood and those sorts of sides.
You're worried, guys, about Max Gawn? I mean, Max is getting on a bit and the body's taken a battering. He's an outstanding player. They've gone for one of the great journeymen in the history of the game, Tom Campbell. He's gone to another club, Melbourne. I don't think he's quite good enough, Tom, to be honest. We've seen that at North Melbourne. We've seen that at the Bulldogs. We've seen that at St Kilda. Is he going to be able to fill the breach if Big Max goes down? What do you think, Damian?
Oh, look, I admire his tenacity. I saw him a lot at Sandringham over the last couple of years, and he's a player that always gives his all. But yeah, just on the face of it, probably not going to fill bloody hard to fill the void of Max Gawn, wouldn't it, in that situation, given his versatility. Campbell is obviously a bigger body, and probably one asset he does have. He can work down and kick a goal if needed, because he can be that pinch hitter that can go up forward and be a bit of a marking target. But he's not a Max Gawn, let's be honest.
It's a great way to survive in footy, Dan. If you're a ruckman who's semi-competent, you can stay in the system for 10 years.
But I mean, is he semi-competent?
Yeah.
You really think so, Darren, do you?
Look, when I say semi-competent, he's good enough to get to the level, but maybe not excel at the level. I mean, he's a ruckman who, he's not a monster, but he gets a lot of the ball. Whenever he played for
Big body.
whenever he played for the Saints, he was usually pretty solid. Like he'd get 14 touches and 15 hit-outs and, do little bits and pieces in support of either Marshall or Ryder in the games that he played at the Saints. So, yeah, look, he's not at the level to be a number one ruckman, or he would have been somewhere. But, he gives – I think if you're developing a kid on your list, so St Kilda were developing Max Heath and people like that, if Heath's not ready for a game and you need someone to almost develop him in the twos at Sandy, then someone like Tom Campbell's ideal. And obviously we'll see that at Melbourne as well with Peterson and a couple of the young guys they might have down there that they can work through.
Well, it'll be interesting. Melbourne's always a watch, has been a watch the last couple of years. And if they don't have a great year, I'd say there'll be some pressure on Simon Goodwin. And I'm not expecting them to have a great year, but we'll just have to wait and see. This is Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures. We're previewing the AFL season. It's part 3 today. We've just looked at Melbourne. We've got North Melbourne, Port Adelaide and Richmond to come, with myself, Dan Lonigan, along with Damian Watson and Darren Parkin for KISS Professional Solutions. 1300 KISS PS 547777, the largest independent providers of copiers and printers in Victoria. They're based in Carrum Downs in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. They take pride in going the extra mile for their customers, aiming to retain them for life. The North Melbourne Football Club in Parker, Daniel and Darling. Some very handy ins, a lot of experience, especially Daniel, especially Parker. I think the jury will be out with Jack Darling, who's very close to playing 300 career games. And, well, it'll be fascinating how they go, Parker. What are you expecting from them? I think improvement. There needs to be improvement, doesn't there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I know I often do the year comparison, and if you look at North's year comparison, 24 versus 23, it looks worse, but I reckon the eye kind of tells you a slightly different story. Like, it felt like they were a little bit better. So, I mean, to work that out, they conceded 250 more points last year than the year before. Their percentage dropped by 8 from 71 to 63, went 3 and 20 in both years. If you break it down, obviously the last 2 rounds were diabolical, 96-point loss to the Dogs and 124 points to Hawthorn. They conceded over 100 points in their first 11 games. There was actually some talk that they might do it every week for the season. And in the last 4 and 7 of the last 8, I think they only conceded less than 105 times. Their average losing margin in the first 11 rounds was 54 points. Last year, they lost 2023, they lost 6 times by less than 2 goals, but only 3 times in 2024. And in terms of kicking 5 goals in a quarter, they did it 9 times, and it happened against them 37 times. Now, that all looks bad, but I reckon it was kind of the opposite in that they got a bit more competitive through the middle part of the year. That was with a little bit less output from Larkey. I think they, after round 10, they improved dramatically in contested possessions. They went from 18th to 2nd in contested possessions for an 8-week period after round 10. They went from 18th to 8th for ground ball gets and from 13th to 7th for clearances. So I don't know. It's one where I love stats, and the stats suggest they were worse in 2024 than 2023. But I don't know about you, Dan. I just thought watching them, the eye said a slightly different story, that they looked like they were getting it together to a slightly better degree.
Well, one of the most interesting aspects I thought, guys, was they could score better. I mean, we saw the Collingwood game, the way they belted Collingwood for a half. As good a half of footy as I've seen from a team all year. I know that's a big call.
Should absolutely have won the game.
Yeah, well, they should have won the game. And they blew Collingwood away, absolutely blew them away. And I remember speaking to a couple of Collingwood supporters, and one said to me, there's some talent in this North Melbourne side that midfield is going to be very, very good in a couple of years' time. And on that day, I hadn't seen a team play better in that first half, but they just weren't able to maintain it. I think, Damian, that's been the issue. But when they got it right, it was fantastic to watch. But the defence just leaked, as Darren has just mentioned, like a sieve way too often. And they need to work on that. And maybe with Comden at centre half back, Lowe getting a full year in to help support core, that might help them become a little bit better down back, because that's an area they really need to tighten up on.
You're quite right. I do think they need, down the track, if they're going to compete and be a final side in a competitive finals unit, I do wonder whether they target, if they have the means to do so, either an existing key forward, or they draft to develop, key defender, I should say, or they draft to develop a key defender going forward who has a bit of strength about him. Comben has been a bit of a foil, I suppose. He was playing in the forward line for the VFL side only 3 years ago. He's done his best, absolutely, but not necessarily a player that has been developed as a key defender. He's sort of been thrown in the role ever since they lost Mackay. He's been that main factor. I know they've had a couple of draftees, Dawson among them, but Dawson still needs a lot of physical development, I think, to really contest in a one-on-one situation. He's a pretty slender type of player who they drafted at the back end of 2023. But they have obviously felt the loss of Mackay. I do wonder whether Caleb Daniel, Dan, given you're a Bulldog man, is he the halfback flanker this team needs? Do you think he can have a bit of a renaissance? I know he doesn't answer all of the defensive problems they have, but can he provide a bit of zip in that respect out of defence?
Oh, I think that was a bad move by the Dogs. I would have hung on to him. The fact he was playing off the bench so often and got dropped, I just did not quite understand that. That's a coach who had a year left on his contract that was experimenting. He doesn't have that this year. We'll talk about them on the next program for KISS Professional Solutions regarding Luke Beveridge. But Daniel's a halfback flanker. He's a playmaker. He's outstanding to watch. He'll be very, very good for them with his ability to deliver. We know how good that midfield is. Cheezel was spoken about. Wardlaw, I know, again, he missed the start of the season. He's had some hamstring problems. McKerch is a good player. Luke Parkin with his experience. I mean, that's a great midfield. And you've got Caleb Daniel running off halfback and delivering to you. Davies Uniacke, another one. That's going to help them. Absolutely, no doubt. No, I think that if he plays in the right position, he could have a super year, Caleb Daniel, and really make the Bulldogs regret making the decision to move him on.
We saw
Dursma as
Simpkin
well, I could say, Dash, just to add in. Zane Dursma is a player who's a good high flyer as well. It's still got a lot of physical development.
Yeah, from that good family. And yeah, Simpkin, after he got knocked out in the pre-season last year, had a slower start to the season where they were playing him out of the square a little bit in more of a peripheral role. So they could certainly get a bit more out of him, courageous, emerging leader within the group. So yeah, he's another one. And you mentioned Comben. He's been one of the most improved players probably in the competition, under siege in that North Melbourne defence. So if you could take some pressure off him, then it'll get even better, I would imagine.
And they've also got, Dash, we spoke about Tom Campbell being an okay ruckman. Cherry is better than an okay ruckman. He's an excellent ruckman. He was terrific for them last year. And as I say, as that midfield continues to develop and the hard body of Luke Parker there and Davies Uniacke, that could be a real strength for them this year. And you mentioned how they picked up in clearances for an 8-week period between rounds 10 and 18. They could be one of the teams that leads that particular stat all year. And if they do, that'll serve the forward line of Darling, Zerha, and also Larkey quite well, I would have thought.
And that's what we mean by the eye test. It looked like for long periods of time they got it together a bit better. Like they, a quarter, a half, 3/4, a couple of matches in a row where it really looked like it flowed. The system was there. You're like, okay, this is what they're trying to do, and I get that. And then they'd fall away and might have a poor second half or something. But eventually that'll come on a more consistent basis. And yeah, that midfield group is going to be the envy of a lot of sides for a while, and obviously the LDU signature is one they'll be sweating on for a fair chunk of the year.
The Saints are keen on him. You seem keen to pay big dollar. Overs is what I'm hearing. Do you really need to pay extreme overs, which I'm also hearing? Enormous amount of money, isn't it?
Yeah, I think if you've got a war chest and you're trying to bring someone over, and obviously there's been speculation around the Tom de Koning offer, which now looks like Carlton have put a pretty decent one in front of him as well for 7 years or longer. I think St Kilda's most pressing need is certainly class in the middle of the ground. They've got some good young talent in other areas. But yeah, getting a real quality midfielder might be the difference between them finishing 10th and 6th in a season, or between 7th and 4th in the future, or one of those little differences as you get better and better as a side. So I think sometimes you have to pay overs, and he's got enough footy in front of him. But for North's sake, hopefully he sticks around with them.
Damian, when they say overs, how much is overs?
Oh, I don't know.
Not
really.
2 million a season. Not even he's not worth 1.5 a season. I don't even think Davies Uniacke's done enough to be worth $1 million a season.
No, I wouldn't say $1 million a season. Absolutely not. Just trying to think of a figure. Maybe is he worth? Well, the average wage at the moment, isn't it, 400,000 per player? He'd be, given the importance, would he be around the 600 mark?
Oh, I think that he'd be looking for a bit more than that, Dash, wouldn't he? If he's going to change clubs. If
Oh
St
yeah,
Kilda really
it's
want him,
more.
they're
I'm
going to
just
have to
saying
pay
what he's.
overs. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's market value. So I'm just
Yes,
saying you expect more than market value in that regard.
you
But
do.
yeah, I think that's what he's worth. But you'd be chasing more than that, absolutely. But yeah, I don't think he'd be at the million mark. Maybe at the 750 mark. Would he
What
settle
about,
for that?
well, if he's Dash worth 750, is
I
Harley
reckon
Reid?
North would pay. I reckon North would pay 750 to keep him. I reckon
Yeah.
St Kilda would have to pay 850 to get him.
Okay.
And what about, while we're talking about this, Harley Reid? Is he going to be worth, after just a couple of years or after his third year at West Coast, 1.2, 1.4, or would Essendon, if they get him, be paying still for potential? Unless he absolutely explodes this year. I suppose that's $1 million question, for want of a better expression.
Think there's an element of potential about him still, and I reckon that'll still be the case in a couple of years' time. I don't think he would have reached his full potential by any stretch at that point. He still has to work on his fitness, in my view, because we know what he's capable of. He's shown glimpses of what he's capable of, but he was at times not running out games. I know Kane Corns brought that point up a couple of times throughout the season. So it's just got to get that ability to build the tank to play AFL footy. I think what you've got to consider, though, with Harley Reid, Dan, he has a lot of marketability, and that, whether you like it or not, does affect your price tag because you bring members in, you bring a bit of hype, you bring attendances up, you bring the marketability of the club up if you have that type of player. So that does factor in, I think, how much they're willing to pay.
So back to North Melbourne. Darling, was it a risk or was it something they needed? Or should have they, Darren, gone with Tim Membry? I would have thought the latter was a better option for them.
Yeah, lining them up side by side, probably. Much of a muchness. Obviously, Darling, been a little bit limited over the last couple of years. Injuries have played a bit of a part in that for him as well. But yeah, I think overall for mine, it's they haven't paid a lot for it, but yeah, there's an element of that top up feel about it. Like I said, be hoping that he's just there for education purposes, plays a dozen games a year, and the likes of Larky and those sorts of guys in the forward line give them most of their drive.
So what do we think? I'm thinking North, 3 wins each in the last 2 years, as has been mentioned. I think they need some discernible improvements. I'm saying anywhere between 6 to 8 wins. Still bottom four, but if they can get 8 wins, they'd be pretty happy with that, guys, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I reckon squeeze out of the bottom four would be the aim. Whether they can do that or not remains to be seen. But I think the target would be get yourself out of that group of bottom four. At the very least, double your win tally as a pass mark. But I'm more in your line of thinking that, win 7 or 8, and in an ideal world, give double figures a nudge if you can.
Gee, that'd be a great effort if they
Just to,
managed to win 10 games.
just to interject, sorry, Dan, do you think, and I know you sort of flagged this a couple of weeks ago, if they don't improve upon last season, is Clarko under a lot of pressure?
Well, he's got money in the bank. Then again, he's only got credit in the bank, if you like. He's only got his team into the finals once, hasn't he, since 2016? And they, of course, had a straight sets exit in 2016 and also in 2018. So is that credit starting to run out? And if they only win 4 or 5 games, it's 11 wins in 3 years. I think he'll get a fourth year. I think I'll give him one more year, but he may also decide that it's just not working too. But I've got a feeling, even because they lost half a year the first year, there were some major issues, obviously, with that Hawthorn racism issue, and he elected not to coach for half the year, that I think he'll get one more after this, no matter what happens. Obviously, if there's discernible improvement, I think they'll look at increasing his contract. What do you think, Dash?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment, but you want to start to see the wheel turn. To say credits in the bank last only a certain period of time, particularly when the credits in the bank were achieved somewhere else. So obviously
Yeah.
your club doesn't have the benefit of those credits. And as you say, going on a decade or thereabouts since their last finals win, which was the 2015 decider, of course, I think he's putting the things in place that suggest that there is that improvement coming, but they wouldn't want to stagnate. If they stagnate, I think there might be some sort of mutual conversations. But I think, yeah, he'll at this stage, if they just show linear improvement, then he'll get the opportunity to coach them into a fourth.
This is Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures. Great to be here for KISS Professional Solutions, 1300 KISS PS 547777. And the website's www.kissps.com.au. John McEncrow and the team run a great business. Whatever your office technology needs may be, they're here to provide sound advice, competitive pricing, and unparalleled customer support. Time to look at Port Adelaide, and things have changed a bit since we last spoke. Ken Hinkley has done a good job to get his team very competitive and even better than that in a position to win premierships, top four, but not good enough to win premierships. And it's not often, guys, that I agree with Kane Corns, but maybe he's right that team that got into the finals last year wasn't as talented as some of the other teams that got into the finals. But now that he's said that this will be his last year and Josh Carr will take over at the end of the year, will the pressure be off him a bit? And maybe he could coach a bit differently, and that might also help the players, not only in the home and away season, but if they're good enough to get to the finals. But at this stage, I haven't got them in the finals, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it was a smart decision, I think, when you anticipate the pressure coming from in the manner that it did, that Port Adelaide would get on the front foot and say, well, we're going to end the speculation. We're going to, explain exactly what's going to happen. But it doesn't remove all possibilities of drama. I mean, if Port Adelaide were to stagnate around the middle of the table, people would probably look at it and go, oh, well, you put yourself into a holding pattern where you're just waiting for 2026. If they fall over, there'd be a degree of impatience, thinking, well, why don't you do it now and accelerate the process? And if they're flying, there'd be that, what are you doing sort of mentality. So it doesn't entirely remove all of those questions, even if it does, for a period of time, put it to bed. But they were interesting, Port, last year. There's always that belief that they're a top four side, but not a premiership side, which is a very rare position to be in. But, 2023, they were ranked second for scoring and 12th for defence. They improved their defence from 12th to third, but they were easily to. There was obviously a sacrifice that came with that. They've lost 5 of their last 6 finals, and 4 of those have come at home, and a couple by really sizable margins. I thought last year they actually handled the pressure better than they have previously in the back end of the year, winning 8 of their last 9 and storming into the top 2. And it felt like they were in the best shape they've really been in under Ken Hinkley before the finals campaign. But then when the finals rolled around, it was really more of the same from the last couple of years. And that's unfortunately been their lot. I mean, you'd love to have their record, but they've obviously had to do better than that when they get to the finals, and that's been their major Achilles heel.
So just in regard to Port, I mean, I reckon, Damian, there are holes everywhere in their list. Not convinced about Zerk Thatcher, and he'll miss the start of the season through injury. They think Radicalea also may not start as well. They've got Alia, and he needs to be an interceptor, so he needs other players to support him. And if you can close him down, they're in diabolical trouble. The forward line, Todd Marshall's out injured. Lukosius is a player without a position, but you think he'll play forward. He's a good pickup for Port if he can play his best football. Didn't quite work for him at the Gold Coast, and he's gone home. They've got that great midfield. They've got Butters. People starting to talk about a future contract with him, whether he stays at Port or moves back to Melbourne. Obviously, Rosie, we know he can play in Horn Francis. They're probably the key members of that side. And then you've got the veterans in Wines and Boak. It's just an interesting situation for a team that keep making the finals, that they still have, to me, so many issues on their list.
There was a lot of debate about that when they were in their pomp in the early 2000s as well, and they did squander a number of chances as well in the finals, as we know, before they broke through in 2004. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think they rely a lot on their nucleus. When I speak of that, I speak of Butters, Rosie and Horn Francis. Butters had a few rib issues, obviously, last year. I think they felt the impact of that. Rosie didn't have as good a year in 24 as he did in 2023. I think he only averaged about 17.7 disposals per game, so it was a bit of a fall away for him. So I think he'll be keen to atone. You mentioned Lukosius as well, and I do wonder if they missed Sam Powell-Pepper as well. He had that ACL injury, which really derailed his season, coming off a 31-goal season prior. He's a pretty good pressure forward, so maybe he adds that element of capability to apply pressure on the defence. So maybe that makes some sort of a difference. And I do wonder whether Mitch Georgiades is going to increase his output and his responsibility as well, particularly with obviously the situation with Marshall. So I think a few players need to step up in order for them to really latch themselves into the top four.
And Dash, do you expect Ken Hinkley to be a little less demonstrative when they have these close wins because it's his last year, or do you just expect him to let it all hang out once again? Because he was criticised for that a bit. I mean, there were times when I thought his behaviour was unacceptable. The final against Hawthorn wasn't right. There were a couple of other games during the home and away season. Look, the wins were very, very important to him. But the fact he knows this is his last year, do you expect his demeanour to change a bit?
Maybe it'll be the opposite, where, last time around he's savouring every moment. He'll get more passionate, more animated, and more emotional, potentially knowing that it's your last chance, it's your last goodbye, your farewell tour, I guess. I mean, that's not to say he won't coach someone else, but certainly with this group. So, yeah, and it'd be fascinating. They play Hawthorn in Gather Round relatively early in the season at home. So, obviously, all of that gets revisited again with Ginnivan and Sicily and everything else that comes with it. So, yeah, look, I think Kenny wears his heart on his sleeve. You know, that passion is okay, but I agree, does let him down from time to time. But I think it resonates pretty well with the group, which is the main thing.
Do you think it does, Damian? I mean, I know they get pumped up, and Ken Hinkley gets pumped up, but at the end of the day, can you have too much of that and you can tire of it?
Eventually, it doesn't seem like the players have tired of it, though. That's the thing. They do, just from the outside, there's been a lot of fractures, I think, at board level with regards to Ken Hinkley and the narrative surrounding him. But players, largely speaking, have played for him. So I think sometimes you need that person in your corner, even if he does go a little bit over the top. So I don't think it detracts too much from a player's point of view. I just think from an optics point of view, he does go a little bit over the top, but as you mentioned, probably needs to worry more about his own backyard than the opposition. But I don't know. It was a situation with that Hawthorn game where he needed to let off a little bit of steam, and Ginnivan didn't really help himself either with some of the comments he made on social media. But having said that, Dan, and I've spoken about this with you before in regards to Chris Scott when he shows a bit of emotion. We can be a little bit hypocritical at times as a media because we ask, we've often, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, asked for coaches and players to not act like robots. And then as soon as they show some semblance of emotion, we're, as a media, the first to criticise them. So, yeah, he has gone over the top, but I don't necessarily mind him evoking that emotion. And maybe he will be a little bit more laid back, given it is his last year, but he'll try and savour it too.
I think there's a perception, Dan, that emotion means lack of control, where it's if you see a coach getting animated and aggravated or agitated, if you will, that it means they're not in control. And I guess that's not necessarily the case, but Brad Scott was another one who often had that leveled at him, particularly at North, that some of the histrionics in the box made you think that he wasn't cool under pressure. And I guess it's understandable to mount that belief, but I guess it's not necessarily true.
Well, I mean, we saw Rodney Eade. He was a classic at it, wasn't it? I mean, everyone sort of laughs about it, don't they? The way Rocket was, it was a little bit different. I mean, he coached a fair while ago now. The game has changed, but yeah, look,
Come on, Will.
yeah, yes, Will Winston. But I mean, what did he describe him as? The smartest dumb player or the dumbest smart man that he's ever come across.
Yeah, dumbest smart footballer, I think.
Dumbest smart footballer. He used to get fired up many, many times. But I mean, the game has changed. And yes, I was a bit critical of Chris Scott. I think that he's changed his demeanour a little bit. I just think you can go over the top a bit. I mean, you're a coach. You've got to keep your emotions in check. I've got no issue behind closed doors getting very excited. But I think as a coach, you are the figurehead of your team. I think you keep your emotions in check. Maybe the odd fist pump, that's fine. But don't get too excited. Certainly don't ignite the players like Ken Hinkley did. And I think that you just get happy about it when you're away from the public eye. Do we think Ken Hinkley will coach again, guys?
Gut feel, no, but that's not to say that I think that would be by choice. I certainly think that there'd be jobs there for him if he wanted it. I just get the feeling that personally he might not.
You reckon Dan and back though? I mean, when you look back at his record, he did regain some respectability for Port Adelaide from where they were in the Matthew Primus era, where they really struggled to draw a crowd. Look, the Adelaide Oval situation probably helped them from a supporter-based point of view, and maybe suited their style of play as well because they could feed off the atmosphere. But then again, didn't win a premiership in that time, and I don't know. I just kind of get this feeling that if they don't win the flag this year, maybe they underachieved under him with the amount of talent they had at certain stages because they were around the top echelon for so long. But credit to him for being as consistent under his tutelage as they were.
Well, I mean, it wasn't just the talent, Damian. It was the fact that it was set up for them on a few occasions. I mean, in 2020, the 2 years it was set up for them were the COVID years, 2020 and 2021. They've won the first final in 2020 and they've gone into a prelim. And because, of course, COVID wasn't as rife in South Australia as it was in Victoria, they could stay where they were and they're in their own beds and then got beaten narrowly in the prelim. And then in 2021 was the one that absolutely got away. They've taken on the Bulldogs, who started in Tassie, gone to Brisbane, won by a point, had to spend a week in Perth to acclimatise just in case they made the grand final. Again, Port Adelaide didn't have to worry about that. They've come back, had to do, I think, their 30th COVID test in 3 weeks. Port Adelaide have been in their beds. They'd won that first final. They'd had 2 weeks off, same preparation all year, and the Bulldogs have absolutely blown them away in the first half. So
I reckon 2020
the two that got away, I reckon, Parker.
2020 especially. I thought 2021, I don't think they would have held a candle to Melbourne in the grand final just on form. I just couldn't see them winning that. 2020, they were a definite chance. They'd beaten Geelong in the first final, who they would have ended up meeting in the grand final. They were obviously right in that Richmond game. They'd actually been on top of the ladder the entire season. So 2020 was the one, I think, ultimately for Port that got away.
I don't think they'll win the premiership because I don't think they'll make the finals. I think they'll be close, but I think this might be just the second year that Ken Hinkley will lose more games than they win. I just don't like their talent. The coach is a good pick-up. We know their midfield, we've spoken about, outstanding, but I just think it falls away. Jace Burgoyne, another year under his belt. He was very exciting back end last year, but to me, if they make the finals, Hinkley's done a great job again in his final year. But to me,
fascinating watch, Damo. Yeah, I don't think they can win the flag. I think it's a similar story to Port, where they could finish anywhere from 3rd to 9th potentially. I think they're capable of winning anywhere from 10 to 17 games. I know it's a wide range, but they're in that group. There's a lot of sides that are a pretty even spread, but I think it's similar in that they're just not quite at the level that can win a flag, but not a bad side anyway.
I'll put them in the top 4. I think last hurrah for Ken. They'll try and win it for him. I know the Marshall situation doesn't help, but overall they do bring a couple of players back from injury. So I think the midfield can go to another cog. I think Rosie could lift and atone after what happened last year, where he maybe didn't have the same output as 2023. So I'll have him as top 4 side.
Where does Lukosius play before we move on from Port?
Should be forward. Should.
Yeah, forward.
Yeah, I think so. I think he needs to be, because even though they've lost Thatcher and Radicalia, I think they probably need a bit more help down forward. He's played his best footy down forward.
Yeah, no Marshall. Dixon's retired. I certainly think they need him there.
You're listening to the Dashing Dan Sporting Adventures podcast for KISS Professional Solutions, and their website's www.kissps.com.au, the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria, with a larger small business in Melbourne, Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury. They also cater for businesses in Wagga. They offer business phone systems, NBN services, CCTV and security systems. Get in touch with John McEncrow and the team. They're based in Carrum Downs in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. Whatever your office technology needs may be, they're here to provide sound advice, competitive pricing and unparalleled customer support. So let's have a look now at the Tigers. They played a match simulation earlier in the week. It didn't look great. They missed a lot of targets. They're very, very young. They've lost a number of players, premiership players. They continue to leave the club, which is a real concern. Obviously, Rioli to the Gold Coast. That's Dan Rioli. Bolton to Fremantle. And the West Coast pair in Jack Graham and also Liam Baker. Obviously, they've picked up all those high draft picks. Smiley, Lawler, the number one draft pick, Armstrong, the tall forward, Trainer, the tall defender, Fall, the tall forward, and Houghton, who probably won't play a lot of footy due to a knee reconstruction. But I'm not sure any of those players, maybe Lawler, will have a huge influence in the first year. Boys, I think it's going to be a pretty tough year for the Tigers and Adamuze, isn't it?
Yeah, statistically, just looking at it, obviously 2023, they were sort of in the frame to play finals until late in the year. Lost 4 of their last 5, which put paid to that, and then 2-21. So that means they've lost 25 of their last 28. And a 2-21 season, statistically, in terms of win-loss records, it's actually the worst season in the history of the club. They had a 2.5-win season in their early years, but that was in a 16-round year. So obviously very different to playing 23 games. A couple of things that were interesting. In the first half of the year, they led Carlton, Port Adelaide, Melbourne and St Kilda at half-time. So that was all in the first 9 or 10 games. They went on to lose all of those, which is obviously the sign of a young side. They only led once at halftime after round 13, and that was against North Melbourne in a game they led by a point, and they also lost that. So all in all, they actually only led 6 times at halftime during the year and lost all 6 of those games, which is quite a remarkable statistic, obviously reflecting on how young they are. But for a club in their 117th season, they're coming off their worst year. They had 5 ACL injuries. Obviously, Tom Lynch missing most of the season hurt them. And then on top of having the worst season in the club's history, they lose Bolton, they lose Baker and Rioli and a host of other Graham and these sorts of players. But clearly they've gone to the draft with an enormous hand and picked up a significant amount of talent. And that's the exciting thing for the Tigers. They're going to watch those players grow in front of them. A lot of those guys are going to end up being stars. Some straight away, some will take a little bit longer. But for Richmond fans, they know where they're at. You talk about the end of an era. For it to be the end of an era, you have to have had one, and they did. And they're in a position now where there's not a stack of pressure on them. They're going to watch a host of young kids and see where they go.
Damian, do you think the narrative changed when the Bulldogs, who weren't going well, and pressure was well and truly on Luke Beveridge, 3 and 5 going into round 9, destroyed them Saturday night at the MCG, and Adamuze said, you can't fault the endeavour. And I thought, really? Am I watching the same game? That Adamuze knew they were in real trouble? I mean, Dash has just reeled off, as he does. So it's great to have the two walking sporting encyclopedias with me and Darren Parkin and Damian Watson about the fact that the Tigers led a number of games at halftime early in the season and then fell away. I think the Bulldogs game is where really the season just absolutely fell away completely. Do you think from then on that he changed the narrative because he knew it was going to be very, very bleak? And were we a bit too critical about him being too soft on his team?
Oh, I don't think he deliberately set out to change the narrative. I think it was just his reaction at the end of that game. Look, I think they're going to struggle. There's no doubt with the lack of experience that they have, and that's a plethora of players and a plethora of experience that it's parking. But I still think back to that game, Dan and Dash, where they beat Sydney, and they had players like McKelty, Lafau, and Peter Campbell, who were very good contributors. And these players are ones who have developed throughout their VFL system. So, considering they beat ostensibly a grand final side, there is a little bit of promise there. And I think Richmond fans could take a bit of solace out of that game. Admittedly, it was pretty early in the season, but in terms of the development, it's going to be a while. I know Lawler had a bit of an incident with Gibney in that practice match against West Coast. So they'll delay the start of his season. And I've had a close look over the last year. It was a pretty impressive draft. So if they were going to have a big hand at a draft, last year was the one because there was a lot of talent there. It's interesting who they've gone for as well. I mean, Jonty Paul, the one that you mentioned, Dan, he's a key forward who wasn't really expected to go into the top 20. He was a bit of a surprise. He sort of built his form with the Rebels very late in the season in the Coates Talent League, and that put him in the frame all of a sudden. But the others were reasonably predictable in terms of who they've gone for, but it's all about development really at this stage.
Did they go for too many tall forwards? They've only got the one tall defender. I mean, the tall defender they want and they need back is Gipskis. It was a high draft pick, but he just can't get the body right, did his ACL. He's a very good player. And in the matches I've seen him play, I really like him. But you just wonder what the body's going to do to him. And they only got the one tall defender in Trainer. but they got three top
Oh,
points. Are they all different? I mean, you guys have seen a lot more coach
yeah.
hire football than I have. I've seen very little. Are they all different? Because that's what they're
Well,
doing.
you mentioned Trainer. You're right. He is a key defender, but he can go up forward and kick a goal. Seen him a couple of
Yeah.
times do that. And he's a very long kick of the football. That's one of his main traits. He can bang it from well outside the 50 in a pretty accurate fashion as well. Saw him kick a goal outside of the 50 in brilliant fashion against the wind in an academy game. And as you said, very good in defence. He can gain a lot of territory from there. And Josh Smiley, I mean, he's a player who can play in defence as well. He's very good in a physical one-on-one type of situation. The amount of fend-ops he executed against VFL sides, VFL standard players, was first class. So he's a player that can be a bit of a swing man in a way as well. I think he's a pretty versatile player who can play in defence too.
And Dash, what about Adam Uzo? I mean, I'm not convinced yet. I mean, it's probably very tough for me to say that considering all the injuries they had. He didn't have a lot to play with, and they were very disappointing, and they were coming off a low base. Pressure on him if they don't show any improvement. I mean, an improvement is being in games for longer. I don't think we expect them to win too many games. We expect them to win the wooden spoon. But if they're not in games for longer, does the club have to have a look at him at the end of the year?
It's a tricky assessment because there aren't too many instances like that. I mean, maybe Matthew Knight's when he took over from Sheedy, where Sheedy was the club legend who been the fabric of all of that success, and then someone had to be the next man in. Obviously, Damian Hardwick came less than 2 years after they'd won a flag, or 2.5 years after they'd won a flag. And they'd played finals the year before, I think in 22 at that stage. And then obviously they had the caretaker situation with McWalter, and then he comes in, they lose a stack of players. All of a sudden they're bottoming out after being up for so long. Then people look at the coach and think, well, what have you done to the list? Even though in many respects it's not him at all. So I think it is a very difficult one for how you get assessed when you follow on from an era like that. So yeah, hopefully he doesn't suffer the Matthew Knight's fate, I guess, who was wedged between a couple of club legends. Whether Adam Uze's there to see the end of this rebuild, hopefully. But yeah, I think he's probably being judged on what is a fairly unique set of circumstances.
And Damian, does Blake Carousella help going back to the club? It's ironic that two men who were there when they were having success winning premierships in Ben Rutten and Blake Carousella are back at the club at Richmond. Rutten's been back a little while now. Does that help, considering he's had a lot of experience as an assistant coach at a number of clubs, Carousella, over the years?
And I think wasn't he recently the coach of the Essendon VFL team as well?
Was,
So I
yeah.
do wonder whether that sort of experience augurs well for him, and maybe he changes his, if he is required to, whether he's learnt change his approach in any way and improve upon his approach. I think it could be a good thing in that respect because he's dabbled in various other areas of coaching.
So what do we think with the Tigers? We think bottom. How many wins? Two last.
Yeah, I think that
Can they win more than two?
Yeah, they can. I mean, they'd certainly be favourite for the spoon, and you compare their level of improvement with some others, but they will look very different, and they'll be exciting, and they'll challenge some sides. I just don't know if they'll be able to put it together for long enough. So, yeah, I mean, they could win anywhere between 2 and 5, I guess, but yeah, I would think it's more about the trick.
And are we expecting Damian, those young players you touched on, Smiley, we've spoken about Lawler, depending on his concussion, to play regularly?
I think, yeah, there's a capacity there. I think with some of the key forwards, like a Fall, for instance, they're going to require a lot of development still. To play in that sort of key role straight away is a bit of a difficult art for a young player because they haven't physically fully developed yet. But I think a player like Smiley could get a fair bit of game time. Lawler, once he's back, he's a pretty stocky sort of fellow who's really worked on his bulk over the last 12 months since he was a bottom ager. So I think those two in particular might get a fair bit of game time, but I think, say, Jonty Fall might still require a fair bit of development going forward, similar way that Abman was, for instance, with GWS. So I think they finished in the bottom two. Maybe they win 4 games.
4 games would be great. It'd be a good result. I think the club would
Yeah.
be quite happy with that. Thanks, boys. Darren Parkin and Damian Watson joining me for part 3, Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures podcast of the AFL preview. And next week, Dash, we are a bit close to home for you and I, so we might be on for a couple of hours each talking about the Saints and the Bulldogs. I'm a bit worried about the Dogs, but I always am with all the injuries they've got so far. And we also look at Sydney, and they're an interesting watch, aren't they, considering Dean Cox has taken over from John Longmire. And West Coast, who you think might improve with the experience of Baker and Graham being added to their list. I noticed Elijah Hewitt, who didn't play at all last year, a high draft pick from a couple of years ago, had a good hit out in the practice match against Richmond. So we look forward to part 4 next week. Thanks, guys. And of course, we're here for KISS Professional Solutions, 1300 KISS PS 547777, and the website www.kissps.com.au. They're the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria. We're the largest small business in Melbourne, Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury. They offer business phone systems, NBN services, CCTV and security systems. They're based in Carrum Downs. They take pride in going the extra mile for their customers, aiming to retain them for life. And g'day to John McEncrow and his team. And thanks again for him and his team jumping on board to support us on Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures. And of course, you can get this podcast on Spotify and all other relevant social media platforms. Thanks, Damian. Thanks, Parko. We'll catch you again next week for part 4 of the AFL preview.